I've worked with elders from a multitude of different backgrounds and cultures, and they all say the same thing, at least about one particular topic, and that is, how do you get started? They have all said that it's very important for us to build relationship with the land where we live. That's just across the board. And doing it in such a way that is reciprocal, consensual, respectful and quiet, humble.
Into the fire, here we go. Into the fire, head to toe. Into the fire, to be seen. Into the fire, to be.
Hello, this is Mark A. Lewis. This is the Sacred Village podcast. I have a guest today from Arizona. Her name is Hilary Giovale. It's a real pleasure. We had some preamble and just getting to know each other. We have a similar trajectory as assimilated people, people that are from the European side of the ocean, our ancestors having settled here. And that process of settling, there are so many different, tendrils of history, of war, amongst each other, and certainly between the colonialists, the settlers, and the indigenous people of Turtle Island. We have both taken an interest in that, probably for different but similar reasons. Now, you've written a book. What is the title of the book?
The title is Becoming a Good Relative, Calling White Settlers Toward Truth, Healing, and Repair.
Okay, well, let's get right into it. What can you tell me about yourself, your backstory, and what led you to having the inspiration to write the book?
Yeah, well, I could always start by orienting around the land where I'm sitting, and I am very fortunate to live next to a sacred mountain of kinship that is situated on Hopi, Havasupai, Dene, Apache, Pueblo land, among other nations. And this mountain is revered by all the nations of this region. She is known as a grandmother and, a very sacred being related to kinship and love. And I have lived here for over 30 years, and I really feel that she influences me. She is one of the reasons that this book ended up being written. And, I descend from people who immigrated to Turtle Island many generations ago, starting 12 to 9 generations ago, and then some more recent immigrants too. And, I descend from Scottish Highlanders and people from the West and the North of Ireland and Germans and Scandinavians and, my family has lived all over the United States through that process of colonization and settling. And I have lived in this spot in northern Arizona for over 30 years. So I never wanted to write a book. I never thought of myself as a writer. I never had that as a goal or an objective at all. But shortly after I turned 40, things started happening in my life that were shocking, that were out of the ordinary, things that I now understand as ancestral communication and intervention that led me down this path. And I am fortunate to have had many very excellent and wise mentors who helped me understand that this was my purpose, to write this book and to begin working with the material in it. And so it was a surprising twist in my life path that has taken me to great places that are just continuing to open my eyes and heart all the time.
Yeah, beautiful. The word that stands out for me there is the heart. I found that a big part of this discussion, a big part of this orientation has to do with the heart for me and being very disconnected from it once upon a time. I didn't go to church. My family didn't go to church. From what I observe, there is the opportunity to be very oppressed as a human being, very much out of alignment within the construct of colonization. There's many opportunities for that to happen, but also within the construct and the dogma of different churches, depending on which church you orientate in. However, there's this other side where there is that opportunity for community and for support. that can happen in a church, and that I didn't have as an individual who grew up in a family outside of any kind of religious institution. So the things that became sacred to my family were material. Materialism was the relationship and was the feedback for identity structures, for assessing whether a person was worthy of what point of view. Well, the point of view, I suppose it would be the mind guessing at the point of view of an institution or an individual who's achieved success, and whether they would view me or, my father, who's, passing this along, as being successful and being worthy of ultimately being worthy of what? Like being worthy of being accepted. Being worthy of being accepted into this elusive community where you actually don't know the individuals who you're trying to be accepted by. The whole thing's absurd. And so, needless to say, as an empathic person, without that connection to my heart, I hit rock bottom in my own way in relationship. And then the journey inward began with the teachings and from the medicine of Indigenous traditions. And so what can you tell me about your relationship with the medicine of the traditions, the medicine of the land, and, and hearing the voices of those ancestors nudging you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, when all of this began for me, it was 10 years ago in 2015. And I was involved with Indigenous-led community organizing, and I had begun forming relationships with Indigenous friends. And almost as soon as those relationships started, I started to see that they had something that I didn't. And I didn't know how to put my finger on it. I didn't know what to call it, but I could see that there was a richness there, a way of being, a way of knowing, a sense of community that I didn't have access to as a white person. And I was very attracted right off the bat, and felt very curious and wanted to be invited. And I was invited sometimes, and then I wanted to be invited some more, but I wasn't always invited. And so I began right away kind of recognizing, wow, these people have a culture and a way of being that I don't have access to. And why is that? And in hindsight, when I look back now, I realize, I had been living at the foot of this sacred mountain by that time for more than 20 years. I didn't really understand that it was Indigenous land. I kind of thought, oh, well, the Native American people live out on the reservation, or they live on the other side of town than I live on. I didn't understand that segregation that we were living in. And it took some very, painful experiences and people being very honest with me and vulnerable for me to really start to get that I am a settler on Indigenous land and that this land is teaching me and has been teaching me as long as I've been living here. And so there's that reality. And then there's the reality of my own ancestors starting to knock on my door in ways that I never anticipated. I'd never even heard of those things happening before. So, things like a piece of furniture that's been sitting there for years suddenly toppling over and hurling items across the floor. That was one of the things that happened. Or I'm in the library and it feels like someone is turning my head, and right there in front of my face is a whole series of books that somehow I'm meant to read. It's books that are based on ancestral mythologies of mine, that are fiction. Things like that, where there's synchronicities, there were dreams, there were people showing up in my life who all of a sudden started talking about how our ancestors had brought us together. And I was thinking, what are you talking about? Because the way I grew up was in a Protestant evangelical family, and ancestors were not to be spoken of as entities who are still current, as spirits who are still influencing us. That was not something that was acceptable. And so all of this was new. And I just decided to listen and pay attention to it because it made me very curious. So it's been, I would say the whole time, it's been kind of a weaving of these two realities of the blood memory of my own people and my own ancestral grounding and mythologies and knowing, combined with the knowing of this land and living here for a good portion of my life and listening to the land.
Yeah, totally. How did you get to learn how to listen or to learn how to trust those voices? Did that come intuitively with you? Like, do you feel like you have something that comes from your lineage that's maybe been passed on, either genetically or
Yes.
spiritually,
Mm-hmm. The more I've come to learn about my ancestors, both the Germanic Nordic peoples and the Celtic peoples, trees are very important to them. And in some of those cosmologies, we are even descended from trees. And if you think about it, what is on a sacred mountain? It's trees. It's covered in trees, ponderosa pine trees, aspen trees, and other trees. And a lot of my early learning just came through walking through the forest day after day and listening. And that, when I learned that I had ancestors who had been early colonizers and enslavers here, I took that grief and that utter just my sense of self was just utterly destroyed. My identity was just, I went into a dark night of the soul. So I took all of that pain to the forest and I began to hear the trees giving me instructions, and I could feel the trees listening to me. Um and I did have teachers and mentors and friends in my life too who said, yes, do that. Yes, go listen to the land, go make an offering on the land, go cry on the land, go put your bare feet on the land. And I feel very fortunate that they gave me those instructions and encouraged me to trust that I could believe in what was happening.
There's so much to cover. I feel like I'm curious about, have you dug anything up in terms of your ancestors from Europe and that heritage and what that might look like? I know you mentioned Germanic and Celtic. Those possibilities exist for me too. The communication that's come through for me hasn't been ancestral. I've had subtle connections with, people that I've known that have crossed over, but not teachings. Like the teachers that come they're not of a lineage, in that way. If they are of a lineage, it's indigenous, like from the local indigenous ancestors or the Lakota ancestors, not my own ancestors. I've been shown for myself that my ancestry, in terms of the trauma, um, it's not important for me to know the story. And it's not that I won't be shown the story or that the story is to be avoided, but in terms of the integration of the emotion, it's not the story that whatever my mind can conjure in order to create some coherence isn't the thing to focus on. The emotion is.
Hmm.
And through the emotion, like I imagine you going into the forest with emotion, I find that, if I'm triggered and but if I extend that into if I'm following whatever thread of feeling into a deeper place in my body, the deeper I am, that is a place that people avoid. However, that is a place that I find my connection through. And so the more I go into that, the deeper the connection goes. And then the mystery of existence reveals itself in, bits and pieces. So I guess I'm curious about, that what have you uncovered about your own lineage, if anything? I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you know, when I was working on the book, it took me 9 years pretty much to write from the beginning of the process until it was published. It was about 9 years. And I had many readers who gave input and read various drafts, and some of them worked with me very closely, like revising things line by line even. And one of the readers that I had told me, very clearly when I thought I had a complete manuscript in 2020, she said, "Oh no, this manuscript is not complete yet because you need to write the portion that's about the recovery of your ancestral memory in Europe." And I was terrified when she told me that because I had a huge amount of resistance. My story that I was telling myself at the time was, I will never be able to connect with that. Those traditions have been severed. I don't have any teachers. I don't know how to connect with that. Everything has been kind of plowed under by the colonization and the war and patriarchy and the religion that happened in Europe, and there's no recovering it. That was the story that I had, but which now I recognize as that is an imprint of the trauma of the European people. And it's not true. It's also not true. And she said to me, you need to go find some elders and start working with the languages. And so I did. I found my first teacher was a wonderful woman who is still a dear friend and mentor of mine. Her name is Sheena McKenna, and she's in Canada, and she descends from Irish and Scottish ancestors like I do. And she has devoted her life to the study of old songs and stories of the Scottish Highlands. And so I began studying these very old Gaelic songs with her. They're old in the sense that they were collected by a folklorist in the late 1800s, early 1900s in remote parts of the Hebrides and the Scottish Highlands. And the melodies that once accompanied these songs are lost to time. And so Sheena has caught the melodies to go with them. So my experience with this relearning of the ancestral ways in Europe means that it has to be a bit of a hybrid, because things cannot be passed down through intact lineages for most of us. In most cases, that has been interrupted for those of us of European descent. But what you can find are symbols and stories and colors and numbers and all kinds of like little breadcrumbs. It's like walking through the forest and following a trail of breadcrumbs. And then for me, knowing what I know about universal, indigenous and animist and earth honoring spiritual traditions, you can begin piecing things back together a little bit. So for example, there are known practices and songs and spells relating to the sacredness of fire in Ireland and Scotland. And so, you can create a practice of honoring fire that calls up those stories, those songs, those practices using a candle in your own home, or it could be a sacred fire that you build outside. But there are ways of recreating based on what's known. And that is extremely fulfilling to me, because that has become like an anchor for me to do the other work that I do, which is all about reparations and, returning land and recognizing what has happened to Indigenous and African American communities here through the process of colonization. And that's very, very painful material, very difficult. And so it's kind of like, in my experience at least, you need that spiritual grounding. You need those ritual practices to give you the strength to do that.
So do you have people in Europe, or where do you find that your primary mentorship comes from? Is it more local or is it across the ocean?
There are several people I've worked with. One of them now has moved back to Scotland. There's a wonderful woman that I study with. Her name is Sarah Extel. She's in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she's part of a group called Healing Roots Community. And they run these interest groups for what they refer to as root culture, which is basically the same thing I'm talking about, root culture or ancestral culture. And so I go to her groups where she teaches and facilitates. She's of Norwegian descent. She's kind of my line to my mother line, which is all the Scandinavian and German people. And then, I continue to study with Sheena, and I've also studied with Mary McLaughlin, who's in Ireland and who teaches old Irish songs and stories. And so there's a whole variety of them. And I know there are many more people, especially in Europe, starting to offer these kinds of teachings now. There's a whole world opening up around this. I think because globally, many of us are starting to understand that what the Europeans did with their imperialism And the way they exported all of this religious trauma to the whole world and this colonial mindset, it's created a lot of damage to all of humanity, and not to mention all of our other, other than human kin. And so I think there's starting to be a growing movement around this.
I've had curiosity about people on the land of Europe and what they're doing to connect to the land if the traditions are fragmented and there's pieces that need to be put back together, who the elders are, like, are there elders that are carrying these medicines and this wisdom? It sounds like there are some. And then what that looks
Yes.
like in terms of the healing that's required, because there's always in all modalities opportunity for bypassing, specifically bypassing the feeling, to avoid the feelings that are uncomfortable. And then the wisdom that can come with, the descension or ascension into those feelings. Personally, I've been very much embraced by the indigenous, the ancestors in particular, and then much more slowly, but also elders and leaders, in the indigenous communities in North America and South America. My trajectory is quite specific around harnessing the energy and the wisdom of the teachers through what I think would be probably best described as doctoring. Whether it's, through the Shipibo, through ayahuasca, I am channeling. It's not me. I have to create a container and work as deliberately as I can to create the hollow bone, you know, concept, as much as possible, to be a conduit for the healing energy of the land, but not just the land, but also the divine. And so you have these two polarities of the indigenous, the land, and then you have divinity, and finding a space in between is where the sacred, way of being can be found, in my experience. And so I was born here. I have ancestors who are from a similar area that your ancestors would be from. There's so many ways to go about it. And so I'm just speaking in speaking with you, I feel like something's happening that I've been kind of calling in a way for quite some time, which is to expand the scope of my awareness to include,
Mm.
the broader indigenous teachings of land that goes beyond the land that I live on and the land that I was born on. And I just want to say that to me is important, but I'm not indigenous in terms of having a lineage of indigenous ancestors. And so I am a
Right.
guest. I'm invited, there's a lot of reverence, and I think a lot of reparation, a lot of reconciliation that I'm doing just by walking my path, just by following the guidance of divinity, of the ancestors, you name it. So I guess the scope of reconciliation, the awareness that, okay, so if we came over with a costume on and then we're realizing that costume was a costume and it wasn't real, we take the costume off. Okay, so now what are we? So we're light skinned, but we're also we have an indigenous heritage. So that indigenous heritage, was taken from us from colonizers at some point. And that process was deeply painful. And then we tried, with the costume on, the costume came with blinders, so we couldn't actually see reality for what it was at all. And so there's this huge miss, because we tried to do the same to you, or at least our, ancestors, or more recent ancestors tried to do that to the indigenous people of this land. And it worked, very, very, it was very, very successful, but not successful enough, in terms of, that horrifying intention to fully assimilate a people into a programming that came from the damage created by colonization. Yeah, I do feel this curiosity about, like, where do you stand in that kind of mosaic experience, as this person who's connecting to these energies, the ancestors, and then looking at the reparation and finding a role in it. How have you uncovered your sense of responsibility in it all, and your orientation, in terms of,
Yeah.
what you find meaningful in the world?
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember several years ago I had come into the awareness that material reparation for the harm that has happened, the genocide, the dispossession of land, the boarding schools and how children were kidnapped and sent away in order to be assimilated into Christianity and, dominant culture, all of that. Like real material reparations are needed. But I felt this blockage inside. I felt so much shame. I felt like, oh my gosh, anything I can do will never even be remotely too close to enough. And I felt really shut down by it. And at that point in my life was when I met an Oglala Lakota elder named Basil Braveheart. And we have just had the most incredible friendship since, I believe, 2018 we met. He's now 92 and he lives in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Early on in our friendship, I went to visit Basil and I was telling him about my ancestors and how long they've been here, and my kind of awe and wonder at why are Indigenous people so kind to me, knowing this about me? Why am I included still, given this history, right? And I remember he answered me very thoughtfully and slowly by telling me a story about his grandmother. And his grandmother, when he was 5 years old in 1938, his grandmother told him the story of the Wounded Knee Massacre, which happened about 20 miles from where he lives and lived at the time too. And she told him, "You mustn't be angry with the soldiers who committed that massacre. You need to forgive their grandparents and their children because they didn't know what they were doing when they did that." And that was just the most unbelievable story to me, because that massacre, the Wounded Knee Massacre, was that was the tipping point for so much devastation of that community, so much harm that came to them. And to think that that would be forgiven, that the perpetrators would be forgiven, was just like mind-blowing to me. And then I remember Basil said, look within yourself and find the center of compassion within yourself and forgive yourself. And those seemed like very simple words at the time, but they became a turning point for me. And I worked with them very deeply for many years, and I'm still working with them. Because there's something about that process of forgiveness of self that enables one to walk on a path of reparations. And it's a mystery to me. It's still a mystery, but I do believe it has something to do with, there's a very big unacknowledged shadow in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. There's an unacknowledged shadow of what has happened amongst us in the past and currently. And there's something about offering forgiveness toward that pain that enables a new future to be created, a new path to be forged. And once I began walking on that path of self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others, the capacity to make reparations grew a lot. And I began working with that very deeply. And there's a Google Doc that I want to share with you for your show notes. That's a guide to making a personal reparations plan. That's what
Beautiful.
I work with. And I facilitate groups around that as well. And it's really putting the power back in the hands of each person to do something, something that comes from our own heart toward reparations.
And mysteriously, somehow having just as much to do, in a way, everything to do with the reparation of our own heart.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow,
Mm-hmm.
because according to the teachings, we're not separate.
Right.
And
Right.
to heal ourselves is somehow connected to the healing of the people that we would also like to see heal, and from the
Right.
misgivings of relatives that are our own, but somehow it's all connected.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So,
And I could add too, like one of the misconceptions around reparations is that there's been research that shows that most people associate that word with being punished, right? And often
Yeah.
it's being punished for something they didn't do. It's like an unfair punishment. And that is not correct because reparations, in my experience, like you just said, they are a form of healing that comes, it's mutual healing. And reparations are not, for me, they're not something that comes out of a sense of guilt or shame. It's much more out of a sense of love. It's love in action. And it comes out of a sense of a desire for mutual well-being. And when they come from that place, they are sustainable, they're exciting, they're energizing, and they're not a big burden to carry.
No, it is a bit of a complicated thing. The mind, in my experience, does want to get in the way, and I've seen that too with reparation also being completely projection around fixing the problem externally, without
Mhm.
doing the deeper work on our own hearts and the forgiveness that's required. It's like, there's so many teachings, and I'm just the learning to have, in order to have a yes, we first need to have a no, and vice versa, like being able to fully say, no, that's not for me. And you really need to have that in order to be able to say, yes, that's for me, as opposed to, oh yes, I'll go along with that because, well, why? Is that a yes from your heart? Oh, I don't know. I never really checked in with that. So where does the yes come from? Well, because I want to please you. I want to be, I want to do good things in the world so I can, but why? Well, because I don't really want to look at this, but because I feel really alone in the world and I want to be noticed and I want to be
Mm.
accepted. And now I'm going to cry because you're asking me these questions, so there's this like peeling back the layers of what's authentic and what's, a real no. You have to go into that, and a real yes, you have to go into that. And when you have those steps that are authentic in terms, in relation to being of service, that capacity to do, to be of service in a way that's truly meaningful, it's a whole different ballgame. And so that all starts with ourselves. So yeah, and these are indigenous teachings, right? So it's like, okay, we tried to wipe this out. Did we try to wipe this
Mhm.
out because we were afraid to fucking cry about the loneliness that we felt? Is that really the primary
Mhm.
reason that we tried to wipe out, millions of people because we were afraid to have a cry? I believe that on some level it is. And it's because, going into our heart and feeling those emotions for some reason to the construct, the paradigm of the mental realm of like having power over domination has gotten so out of control that the fear of having a cry has just become the most important thing to avoid. So
Mhm. Yep.
it's wild.
That's
It's
true.
absolutely wild. And
It is
it's
wild.
crazy.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
So,
And,
yeah.
I can tell you too, like when I, started this process and started going out in the woods and feeling that grief and allowing myself to cry, that was the message I got over and over. It was like, these tears need to flow. And that's the only way out is through this pain. And it's
Yeah.
okay to let these tears fall, let them fall in the snow, let them fall on the land. And there's something really powerful about that.
Yeah, totally. I think, the more we cry, the more we open up to being a vessel for spirit, and whether that spirit, because it can take on different forms in my experience, whether it's, just feeling the light of God coming through, or a grandmother. It can be a grandmother from the earth that you're walking on, which shares this divine feminine, has a relationship with the divine feminine, with the divine mother, depending on your orientation and what you're feeling. And there's a relationship, like it is all connected also. And so to be able to be a vessel for that, that's, now we're talking in terms of, that
Mhm.
capacity to be able to show up and help with real reparation. But yeah, it's a paradox. You have to be careful about the projection, so careful, so mindful about wanting to fix. That's from an elder, a Blackfoot elder that I've sat with many times, and he has such a great sense of humor, and that's one that he references quite a bit. And he uses his hands like to fix the thing. Like, be careful of that.
Mhm.
Like, that's been
Mhm.
etched into my
Mhm.
mind, and I really appreciate that teaching because that tendency is very real, and it definitely
Yes.
comes from my nervous system. So
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, I've experienced that many times too. Often that will be the first impulse, is to try to
Hmm.
fix things, especially when, sitting with survivors of atrocities, or, people who have undergone horrible harm and trauma. There's a strong desire that I feel to fix it. And then I've
Hmm.
had to recognize many times there is no way I can fix this. I just have to feel the impact of this.
And
Yeah.
surrender.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, and somehow God, and in Lakota is Wakan Tonka, which is great mystery. So to be humbled that God is not something that we can get our heads around. It is a great
Mhm.
mystery. And so that includes everything that's real. God includes everything that's real. And so acceptance, true acceptance of it, and surrender to it with humility, for me, the depth of that is when I get into, when I really feel the depth of that, I feel the love of God too, somehow, mysteriously, is still there in all of its carnage and tragedy. Somehow it's still there. And yet, what's important is to bring the light as much as we can, in my experience.
Mhm.
So I'm really glad that you referenced that. So the Google Doc, I'm wanting to tap into that, and to make sure that people have that. That feels important. feel like a strong yes to that. I'm going to look into that myself, um, and I'm really grateful that you've referenced your ancestry. I really feel strong, uh, just a strong hit of this light from Scandinavia is even in talking to you,
Mhm.
that's there and that's alive. And it's like, so these
Mhm.
things, and the songs that I've learned from this land, from North America, the teachings that I received is that, the ones that I hold close to my heart, they were gifted to people through different ceremonies, whether it was the sweat or fasting. They came in through spirit. So those were gifts from spirit. And so there's obviously no reason that through prayer and with surrendering and reverence, that an individual living on Iceland today can't receive a song from spirit in order to help them rebuild or cultivate a connection, an awareness with the land, and then the community that grows around that, and all the
Mhm.
humility that comes with that.
Yeah.
So there's beautiful things happening on our planet. There are a lot of ugly things, but there are a lot of beautiful things.
Yeah. That's
Um,
true.
is there anything that you want to share around, what we've spoken about? I'm also wanting to get a little deeper into your book. Do you want to go? Why don't we go into the book? And is there anything that stands out in terms of what your book addresses that feels important to share?
Mhm. Well, one thing that you just said that is occurring to me to share about, and the book does talk about this a little bit, and then since the book has been published, I'm getting deeper into experimenting with this. And it is the idea that, you know, through the process of colonization and European imperialism, there has been a culture of white supremacy that has been built. And we are seeing this glaringly in our face right now in the United States. And, it's based on patriarchal norms. It's based on, the idea that white people are normal and everyone else is deviant. It has a lot to do with Christian nationalism, etc. And so one of the things that I really took away from my research in writing this book was the mandate that I have heard go out from many people of color and indigenous communities, that those of us who identify as white, who are walking around in fair skin and who are part of the European diaspora, we need to create a new culture for ourselves that is devoid of domination. And that's really interesting. That's an interesting assignment for me, because part of the white conditioning is to not be aware of it, not be aware that we are being conditioned, and to never discuss it, and to pretend that, we're normal. And but the truth is that whiteness was engineered. Even several hundred years ago, none of our ancestors were considered white. They were people of distinct cultures and communities and, practices throughout Europe that were all quite diverse and varied quite a bit. And so, yeah, this idea of creating a new culture is one that is super interesting to me. And I have been doing some experiments with that lately, and also, really basing it on not just pulling it out of thin air, but basing it on what can still be found of the European cultural traditions that our people once practiced. And there's a lot there. And I can share also with you in the show notes some of my favorite books and resources to point people to, because I feel this is really important. Like some of the cruelty that's going on in the world today, the greed and the hoarding and the war and the othering and all of it is, I think it's because it's related to, at least, the fact that the white culture is based in domination and supremacy. It has no roots other than that. And the thing is that human beings all need culture. We need norms, we need songs, we need rituals, we need practices, we need ways of establishing uh, balanced relationships with the land where we live and with the plants and animals with whom we eat. And we don't have a way of establishing that in the current culture. So we've got to create a new culture. And this is something, how does culture get built? Well, I think about it and it's like, it's going to take a long time. It took a long time to create the system of white supremacy that is now running the show all over the world. But it may take some time. It may take several generations, but we can build a new culture. And so I'm trying some experiments with that now. And it's been really fulfilling, just to try things out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just something I wanna lift up, because I've heard that really clearly as a mandate that we need to do that,
Mm-hmm.
create an identity for ourselves that goes beyond that sense of supremacy.
There's definitely something happening. There's a culture that's forming that would be best described as love and light. That becomes an alternative to the normative culture, but that seems to address primarily the, for the psyche of individuals. I think like with women, there's the maiden, there's the mother, there's the crone. For men, I'm not sure about the chronological archetype in it that would reference that. But for me, in working in men's circles, there's the warrior, lover, magician, king, like these different aspects of self that help to bring a Jungian perspective in terms of, what part of this, including the shadow of each, can we work with in order to reclaim a sense of wholeness, a sense of heart connection, connecting to our body, not being severed from the neck down, because if we go into our body, we're afraid of what we're going to experience. We're actually terrified of the experience of feeling from the neck down, and to a certain degree. But this, when I see these, there's so many people that are without an option. So you have what you have in front of you. You have where the culture is wanting you to go for its existence, or at least there's this tug of war over the left and the right, and that whole thing is a bit dizzying because it still leaves you not really feeling from the neck down, and from my perspective. And so this other culture seems very, very important. I'll tell you, for me, that the guidance for me has been starting being severed from the neck down, going into the indigenous teachings, reclaiming a connection to my body, reclaiming a connection to the capacity to grieve, the capacity to feel, the capacity to have a voice, to stand up for myself, the capacity to growl, in ceremony or in a men's circle, the capacity to be humble and to connect to a femininity, like a divine feminine, and to understand how nurturing that has been to me, and to be able to bring that to my 1-year-old, and my 12-year-old alike, and my 20-year-old. Those are the ages of my 3 boys. And so there's this beautiful thing that's unfolding through the Indigenous teachings. And at the 11th year of ceremony for me, after 11 years of digging really deeply into the Indigenous teachings and ceremonies, at the very end, what do I see at the top of the sacred tree is the Son of God and the Divine Mother. And Anaya did not grow up religious, and so to have a Christ, the Spirit of Christ, come into my heart, on the edge of, beyond the edge of surrender, intellectually is fascinating, but spiritually is just liberating. But it's not an either or. It's not like, okay, now you're done with the Indigenous teachings, now you can go and become a Christian. It's like, no, not even close. It's like the incorporation of all the things. And so, but now my point is, though, is that I haven't been groomed by going through all of these rites of passage and Indigenous ceremonies in order to become another Indigenous person. I'm becoming something else. And I look around and it's like, I'm becoming something that doesn't really exist yet,
Yep.
except for there are exceptions to that, but they're over there, they're in Arizona, and it's like, okay, so what's being cultivated? Well, I think what's being cultivated is the recognition of an alternative, which is a culture that it can be and embrace the love and light, because I think that there's something to that. There's a lot of spiritual connection that people are tuning into, but there's also the shadow, there's also the dark, there's also like the depth of the soil and the teachings that come from that in order to incorporate the wisdom of the earth. And sometimes that's pretty icky and scary, but it's so beautiful once you actually settle in there and get to know it. And it's like, this is not what I thought. And so those Indigenous teachings are so profound. And so wherever we're getting these teachings from the ancestors of Europe or North America, it's a blessing and it's a courtesy from Spirit in order to give us the opportunity to create something different, something that I think that you're speaking to. And I am absolutely loving the fact that this is a part of your purpose. It feels very heartwarming for me. And I feel just, a little bit less alone in the world. Like every time that I come across somebody that has a similar experience in the world. And it also just brings up a recognition of just how loving the ancestors of this land and the land, of Europe, all over the world, and how much love there is on this planet should we decide to connect to it and surrender to it. It's safe to surrender to, right? To get on our knees and cry and pray. It's safe to do that. Like there's nothing less loving than that experience. So nothing more loving than that experience.
Yeah. That's
So
beautiful. It's a beautiful way to describe it.
yeah. So what are the baby steps then? What can we, before we have about 10 minutes that I'd like to spend. I want to go into, what we can do to, the baby steps around this to make sure we have a good container around this topic before we have a closing. But
yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I have been very fortunate to be able to co-teach and co-facilitate groups with this material for the last 6 years or so. And, teach it through a variety of different lenses and topics. And in that process, I have asked, elders to be guest speakers and provide input and offer feedback and etc. And it's been very interesting to me because I've worked with elders from a multitude of different backgrounds and cultures, and they all say the same thing, at least about one particular topic, and that is kind of how do you get started? And they have all said that it's very important for us to build relationship with the land where we live. That's just across the board. And doing it in such a way that is reciprocal, consensual, respectful, and quiet, humble, So what that looks like is, going out on the land, walking in the same places over and over, listening for what calls to you. Maybe it's a stone or a tree or a lake, allowing yourself to be drawn to a place through your intuition, going to that place and saying, "May I sit with you?" and listening for the answer. And if the answer is no, then move on. If the answer is yes, then bringing a gift, and that could be an offering of water. It could be an offering of flowers or herbs or your favorite food. It could be a song. Because to me, this is one of the things that's the most sad about the severance of our European lineages is that we don't always know the correct offerings to make. And in many places, depending where you go, there are very culturally specific offerings to make in specific places. And other offerings might not be okay. Like I was told by an elder in Ireland to offer whiskey to the Sidhe, the spirits of the other world, or the good people, the fairies. But I think offering whiskey here in Turtle Island is not so good. That's not culturally appropriate. So for me, it's like we can go back, even if we don't know the culturally appropriate offerings for here, we can offer things that are very simple, that are universal and human, like water. And then, sitting with that place and listening. And then, the next step on that trajectory for me has been to really pay attention, not just while you're sitting on the land, but when you're going about your daily business. Did you have a dream? Was there synchronicity that happened? Was there a feeling in your body when you encountered a certain piece of literature or art or a certain kind of conversation? And it's really about retraining our minds to use more of our faculties, more of our senses, and feel. And then trust. So like one thing that Basil Braveheart has said to me is, he's been teaching and working with people for 40 years. And he said, decades ago, people were hesitant to believe the things that they saw out of the corner of their eye, or the feeling that came over them, or the song that they heard on the wind, or whatever it may be, right? And he said now they're getting more able to believe that's real, that something happened there. And that's a transition that we are probably making culturally and as a species, hopefully, to moving toward being able to reclaim those gifts and those skills. But he did say, we have a tendency in the West to dismiss something as, oh, that was just my imagination. But he said, maybe it's not. Just try it on, And so maybe try imagining and don't dismiss it as just your imagination, because your imagination is very powerful, creative force. So those are some of the beginning steps that I tend to share with people when working in groups, and they're in everyone's power to do on your own, in your own time, in your own way, and they have the capacity to reshape our orientation to reality, and we need that right now because we're facing a lot of crises that need fresh ways of seeing and feeling and perceiving. That's those are some of my beginning steps.
Yeah, all those things seem like building blocks to leading a good life, because those are the ways that we would be living if we were in, alignment, with our village, with our elders, with Mother Nature. Yeah, all the things. I have there's a bit of a paradox that I'm working with, or that I have to contend with, which is that there's a process unfolding in terms of relationship to ceremony. And ceremony, there are Indigenous people who are very much afraid to have their ceremonies stomped on, and by people with light skin or assimilated people, mostly the light skin though, because of the history. And yet ceremony is so very much needed at this time. And so there's a it depends where you go. At the place that I go to now, that problem doesn't exist at all. But I've seen it, and it's like I understand it because there's something happening, in ceremonies where there is fear, where there is I don't think we don't want you here, which is fair enough. We're doing our own healing. Or if you're coming, you're subordinate.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see ancestors. Like you
Mm-hmm.
don't do this, you don't do that, because that just doesn't feel safe. So you need to be subordinate in order, because right now, I recognize you as an individual who is a part of a paradigm of dominant, subordinate all day long, and I'm just not ready to trust you. And so there's
Yeah.
these rules that come in, and so there's oppression that happens through a lens, a very particular way of looking at the situation. And there's other ways to look at it. There's many different ways of looking at that situation, but one of them is that there's keeping the people that, a group of people that need ceremony from ceremony ostensibly. The truth is that nobody's being kept from ceremony because nobody's policing what people do behind closed doors. The Indigenous people aren't actually, that have an issue with white people coming to their ceremony. They're not, there's no policing that's happening. There's a lot of shaming that's happening and warning in a way that is, feels a little bit like a residue of the dark side of Catholicism in a way, which also, there's just a lot of cleaning that has to happen, and it has to happen so gracefully and tenderly, but ceremony does still have to happen. And it has to happen with reverence for the ancestors. And because when we step into ceremony, even if we don't have reverence, we will learn it. The spirits of this land will teach us what we need to know. They will teach us even if we're coming in there naive. If we're coming in there with a fully colonized, dirty kind of perspective. But if there's a curiosity about what happens when I put tobacco down, or what happens if you're doing the monkey see, monkey do, following the leader, because maybe you've hit rock bottom and you don't want to go back to alcoholism, because that's the other option that you might have. And so you're just trying these things on. It might get kind of ugly, but there's going to be a churning and a cleaning of the mind and the energies. And there's a process that's unfolding that, I don't know, it's very complex, and it ends up really becoming, who you are drawn to and who you speak to, and which elder that you speak to, and the guidance that you get, and learning and being reminded that the journey is always about reclaiming a connection to your own heart, first and foremost, I think. And that it might be messy here and there along the way, but something's unfolding that's cleaning it up. And that once that culture that you're talking about becomes more and more prevalent and accepted by the Indigenous people of the land that we're both now sharing, but in the context of understanding who the Indigenous people are and who the new Indigenous people are, and understanding the difference and what those differences imply. So there's not a misunderstanding that we're going to be taking on a different costume that's still going to be about taking away the land, taking away the traditions. So there needs to be so much humility and reverence around that. And yeah, I do see this reclaiming of culture happening with that reverence and understanding that there are custodians of land, and they have been here for hundreds of years. And the ancestors of those Indigenous people are going to be supporting the unfolding of that in a good way. And it may seem like it's impossible to have a whole lot of white people, becoming decolonized and not wanting to claim something once again that isn't theirs. For there to be a reverse of kind of assimilation, but without it being about domination, through a reversed lens of, well, we were here before, and so you kind of have to do what we say. It's not going to look like that, but there will be an honoring of, this is your territory and we're here as guests, but we're also now here not as guests. And somehow that paradox, we have to live with that. We have to live in it. because we need to be able to have our own leaders, and our leaders have to have a connection to the land, and our medicine people have to have that connection to the land and not be questioned by someone who is seemingly or views themselves as being superior because they have deeper roots to the land or more long-lasting roots to the land. So the whole thing is very complex, and we're not going to become like Israel, where we go into, a place and that we choose that it's actually taking away somebody's land again. It's not going to work that way. And so how does it work, right? And these
Right.
teachings, as they're on, as I'm, speaking about them, this is going to be the world over, and the global, circumstances of Israel and Palestine are becoming our teachers for the very thing that is our future also, which is
Yeah,
true
good point.
reconciliation. Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
going to require a lot of
Yeah.
elders along the way, right, to get through the.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, another
And
tangent.
also I think it requires the teaching of becoming a good relative and what that means. That means different things in different places for different communities and different individuals, but
Yeah.
ultimately that is what that means to me, is how can we live here together in equity, in harmony, where all the children are fed and the
Yeah.
water is taken care of and the land is taken care of,
Yeah.
So
Totally.
yeah.
That feels like the heart of what I, just kind of went on a bit of a tangent on. You brought it right back to the heart. How can we be a good relative? Because there is a priority, and there will be a priority. We will be prioritizing our family, our children, and so will anybody else around us. And then we will take a step back and we'll prioritize our community over the next community. But then that question of how can we be a good relative to the people who are next door to us, to the families next door to us, to the communities next door to us, that becomes the fundamental question. Israelis and Palestinians, if they were asking that question, how can we be a good relative? And that's the process that we're all learning. So beautiful. Thank you so much for bringing that back. And that's the title of your book. So that what a bow that kind of gets tied on that, because that is a very deep topic, and comes with a lot of questions and a lot of surrendering that will be required along the way for a lot of people over and over and over. Yeah. Well, any final, conclusion from yourself, any last final words that you'd like to share?
Well, I would just like to encourage listeners that I still believe there's a way through all of this mess that we are in as a global community. And it has to do with remembering the past and creating a new future that pulls the best of our legacies from the past forward. And so, yeah, I just want to leave people with encouragement and hope.
Yeah, no question. We wouldn't be talking here today if the great mystery wasn't involved, in the forward movement towards that, towards more alignment, with our surroundings, and learning how to be better relatives. Thank you, Hilary.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's great to talk with you.
Yeah, it was a very beautiful conversation. I really appreciate it. Well, I'm going to close the podcast, close the episode. So thank you again, to our guests, and thank you to the listeners, those of you who joined us for this this very layered conversation, very important conversation. Check out Hilary's book. Could you repeat the title again?
Sure. It is Becoming a Good Relative, Calling White Settlers Toward Truth, Healing, and Repair. And I will share a link to some independent booksellers for the show notes.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And have a beautiful day. This is Mark A. Lewis, Sacred Village Podcast. Over and out.
I lay my head down.
Check out my lovely partner's music, Kristina Jessen, at KristinaJessen.com. And there's also more information on what we're doing. We're doing a land project up here, traditional land development with a community intention. And if you're interested in any of the retreats that we're a part of and part of organizing, you can find all that information at sacredvillagepodcast.com. Have a wonderful day.